Hey guys, this is a super big old Halo lore video about just like the old Halo universe before the Halo universe that we know currently, so before the firing of the rings. I'm doing this because I hit 1 million total likes on my TikTok, which is amazing. 1 million likes is crazy. So this lore will be going over the ancient humans, ancient forerunners, precursors, and the flood, and just their creation all together and how their amalgamation of everything that they did affects the Halo universe now. So thank you guys so very much for the 1 million likes, and I hope you guys enjoy. Starting off with ancient humanity, the ancient humans had a military that rivaled the forerunners. In fact, the Didact had said that they were the second best. However, many records would tell otherwise, and they would suggest that humanity was the best. The forerunners had still believed humanity was their biggest threat, even after the flood had already consumed 90% of the forerunner population. Now, the ancient humans had grown in strength and in technology since their several dark ages, and since they go into dark ages all the time, they'd always come back stronger, and they'd stand proud as the only rival to the forerunners. However, the humans would be the first to uncover the flood and were the only ones to defeat them. Ancient humanity used scorched earth policies to lead the flood onto planets before glassing them into nothingness. And by doing so, they sacrificed a third of their total population, implanting them with destructive, artificially programmed genes used to target the flood on a genetic level. However, those genes that they had done and implanted didn't really work as well as just the glassing of the planets did. And this didn't come without a cost. They lost so much land that they had to invade forerunner space, and eventually they waged war on two fronts, trying to defeat the flood while also trying to survive, and while also fighting the forerunners who had thought that they had become disgruntled with the forerunner ecumene and wanted to fight back. So for 53 years they fought, and they held off the forerunners. And just mind you, the Human Covenant War was only 25 years. So for 53 years they fought, they held off the forerunners, which is the most advanced species at that time, and in 53 years they had quote-unquote defeated the flood, as the flood had chosen to retreat, but they still lost to the forerunners. And as punishment for defying the forerunners, nearly all of humanity was wiped out, and the remnants and technological achievements of their civilization was extirpated. Furthermore, the surviving humans were subjected to a process of biological devolution. Although ancient humanity wasn't superior to the forerunners, their understanding of precursor technology and superior military tactics would have made them the most powerful species in the galaxy. Had they not been fighting a war on two fronts with 2/3 of their population already dead, they could have possibly won. The Forerunners are an ancient civilization of beings created by the Precursors. They were blessed with near god-tier intelligence and strength. For millennia, the Forerunners controlled over 3 million fertile worlds across the Milky Way galaxy under their empire, more so known as the Forerunner ecumene. The Forerunners would master many arts and sciences at the feet of the Precursors, which are also the creators of all life in the galaxy, serving as their assistants and adjustants while the strange workings of their minds and artifacts eluded the Forerunners' most keen intellects. As their interstellar civilization developed, the Forerunners came to believe that they would be judged worthy to the inheritors of the Precursors' mantle of guardianship of all life, also known as the mantle of responsibility. The Forerunners discovered and claimed the mantle of their own, but the Precursors did not approve of this, and made the decision to strip the Forerunners of the mantle, wipe the Forerunners out, and pass down the mantle to the humans instead. Forerunners, however, understandably, did not like that, and they responded by overthrowing their godly creators, exterminating most of them in retaliation. Around 107-445 BCE, the Forerunners went to war with humanity's interstellar empire, in response to a perceived invasion of worlds where the Forerunners had relocated other species. The Forerunners had perceived humanity's actions to be a threat to the principles of the mantle, and therefore waged decisive war against the humans, subjugating every human-controlled world and wiping them clean of all traces of human civilization. As punishment, humanity was stripped of its empire, technology, and was exiled to its homeworld, sent back to the Stone Age. However, ancient humanity didn't attack worlds because of resentment. As you probably understood from before, they uncovered a dark horror, one which they could not contain: the flood. Eventually, they had been pushed to beyond the edge of the galaxy, essentially by humanity's military efforts, and was not seen again for nearly 9 millennia. The forerunners would then send their attention to finding a solution to the flood. The Didact suggested building shield worlds to protect those inside and force the flood to starve on the outside while those inside lived peacefully. However, they denied it so that they could build giant super weapons that hopefully kill the flood. The Halo Array. Roughly 9,000 years after their war with the humans, a forerunner survey team on the planet Seaward came into contact with the flood. After this first contact, the forerunners immediately recognized the great danger the flood posed to the entire galaxy and attempted to contain them. They failed. They did not declare war until it was far too late. Using their extensive intelligence, they tried every possible option to defeat the flood. The most effective was the Prometheans and Sentinels, simply because they could not be infected. However, it didn't really work too well. See, the Sentinels, they were designed to fly above the parasite, avoiding destruction, encouraging quick reaction times, and they came in many different sizes and had many other jobs as well. Their main feature was their superheated laser beam that would melt the biological masses that the flood are made of. And the Prometheans are horrific assholes that were created using the digital reconstruction of living souls, most commonly human beings. However, the Didact did use his own Promethean knights that were forerunners. But the Didact believed there was something special about humans that prevented their infection. So he wanted to use that to create the ultimate counter, which that was post-flood-infected, logic-plagued Didact. Now, the Didact even composed his own warrior servants to attempt to kill all of the flood, and although it was working better than the forerunners fighting the war themselves, it didn't work well enough. It really hardly even slowed the flood. Because of all this, when discussing a solution to the infection, the most powerful, intelligent, advanced, and strongest species in the galaxy had only one solution that could work: starve them to death. In doing so, the forerunners, the most powerful species the galaxy had ever seen, had killed all life in the galaxy just to hope the flood would starve so they could reseed the galaxy of life and start anew. Nearly anything you could think of, the forerunners could make quite easily. The question of why they didn't was always up to the mantle responsibility. The Halo Array was a huge breach of the mantle responsibility, but it's the only thing that could work. And in the end, it didn't. The flood still existed, not only on forerunner research stations, but in just random places across the galaxy. Now, I mentioned these Promethean warriors. Now, these Prometheans used to be some of the greatest warriors in the galaxy. They were always trademarked by their lethality. However, to ensure the survival of firing of the Halo Ray, the Didact began the composition of these greatest warriors, turning them into these soulless robotic warriors known as the Promethean Knights that we see in Halo 4 and 5. The composition process was a process of excruciating pain, designed to translate an organic being's mental content into machine data. It was designed as a way to counteract the flood, but flood victims subjected to the composer processing were able to retain their individuality. However, the flood would begin to continue to rot and deform their physical bodies, the infection having survived the destruction of the original biological body and would resume it in the completely new one, as if the flood rewrote the biological's genetic code. Now, this composer could turn those biologicals into soldiers known as Promethean Knights. These guys were soulless, dumb AI programmed with the knowledge of logic plague to ignore the flood at all costs, designed only to kill. Now, they still retain some of the memories and thoughts of the original soul and being that was composed into them. However, they cannot control their urges to do as they're told, which is why the Knights fight us in all of the Halo games. Now, the Knights typically use hard light blades capable of cutting through to the toughest metals and hard light weaponry capable of turning any material to dust, and since they were digital armigers, they can even teleport. The only time they were ever commanded was when they were under the control of the Didact and created Cortana. Otherwise, they stay dormant, protecting forerunners and forerunner artifacts. Which, coincidentally, both of those people were infected with the logic plague, and both times the Prometheans were used to fight humanity, and more so for carnage and a weapon rather than what the forerunners originally intended. Now, the logic plague is mental infection of all beings capable of thought and logic, strong enough to infect the most smartest, most advanced AI, blah, blah, blah. We'll get to that later. But even the Promethean Knights couldn't defeat the flood. forcing the only solution to be sterilizing the entire universe and starving them to death. Now, I've been talking a lot about the flood, but you can't talk about the flood without talking about the precursors as well. Now, the Precursors is a very mysterious species. Back in the Bungie days, it used to be the Forerunners being that species. However, in the 343 Industries days, it is the Precursors. Now, the Precursors originated outside the Milky Way galaxy and arrived in the galaxy billions of years ago. They were an incredibly advanced race of beings who explored many galaxies and seeded them with life over the course of billions and many billions of years, as part of an experiment. Now, it's suggested that they created the Milky Way galaxy, however, there is no evidence to prove that. Now, as transcendent beings, they existed on a level beyond that of conventionally sapient biological organisms. They were described as dreamers and makers of whose minds transcended many realms and having infinite forms, many voices, and a singular purpose. Which is a very weird way to say that they are just pretty much gods. Now, the Precursors were not tied to any particular physical form, assuming any shape as they saw fit. They would allow themselves to die away and be evolved anew over and over again, taking on numerous incarnations, both physical and immaterial. Now, the Precursors based their experience and their existence around the philosophical concepts of the mantle, living time, and metatechnological mechanism known as neural physics, which enabled them to manipulate the fabric of the universe. Now, the Precursors were responsible for seeding the Milky Way with life, creating the galaxy's diverse composition of species to become new tools and companions, and engineered millions of star systems. Over time, they would also judge whether a species was worthy of the mantle of their assumed role of guardianship of all life. At one point, the Forerunners, one of their creations, was chosen to uphold the mantle responsibility. However, they later changed that idea and that plan and planned on killing them all. However, they decided not to, and chose to show humanity, the new inheritors of mantle, to decide. Unfortunately, the Forerunners made an expedition to Path Chthona, where they encountered their creators and accidentally found out this genocidal plan around 10 million BCE. The Forerunners decided to prevent this fate and furiously retaliated against their creators and drove them to near extinction, first in the Milky Way and eventually in the satellite galaxy of Path Chthona. A few Precursors escaped or were spared by the Forerunners. They either went into suspended animation or became molecular dust that was eventually meant to regenerate into their past forms. However, over millions of years, that dust became defective, failing to reconstitute the Precursors and instead inducing madness and mutations in life forms that came in contact with it. This form would be later known as the Flood. Now, the Flood. There are two ways to be infected by the Flood: physical and mental. Physically, an infection form cuts and burrows into your chest, tapping into your nervous system, and gains the control of your body and mind. These guys are quite literally bigger than your own head. The Flood could also infect you if you breathe in a Flood spore. It's a molecular structure that, when ingested, multiplies and spreads the Flood supercell throughout your body, eventually getting into your mind, using your body's biomass, and it will also shift and create combat forms through this infection. This is an airborne infection and usually is found in large clouds of dust. Physical infection will typically result into creation of a combat form used to spread the infection. They have a large tendril whip, which is also used to create large gashes in your body that can leave some of that Flood supercell in your body, also infecting you. They also have sensor tentacles. They usually have a snapped neck, and the whip is typically made of a calcium biomass found in your own body and can be hardened into a sword-like weapon or into a whip-like tendril. Any infected being will have its thoughts and mind taken from, and knowledge will be put to part to something greater, or someone, also known as the grave mind. All infected forms that are not able for combat will be used for biomass, used to create a proto-grave mind. Now, proto-grave mind is just this small blob of mass that they typically use to create a grave mind, and usually they'll find a really smart being to be the main soul, the main person to be infected, and the rest will just be biomass to enlarge that grave mind. Now, they kind of do look like a stress ball of bodies and faces, but a proto-grave mind is the early creation of a grave mind. Because of this, the more biomass it gets, the more intelligence from past grave minds it gets. Eventually, when a grave mind is fully formed, it will have the intelligence of all grave minds before it, dating all the way back to the first, the primordial. The gross combination of precursor that never fully became flood form, essentially making a grave mind from a revived primordial. In this form of the grave mind, the flood now has the intelligence to create pure forms, which are forms of pure biomass controlled by the grave mind and can switch between many forms, such as the tank pure form, juggernaut, sniper, and some others. Some forms can be upwards of 11 feet tall like the juggernaut, and some can be really small. Now, mental infection. We talked about physical, but what about mental? In this form, the flood can also use the logic plague. Basically, the logic plague manipulates and uses twisted logic to make you think that the grave mind in the flood is in the right. The flood can do this to any intelligence. The didact, who is a physical being. Cortana, who is a smart AI, but dumb in comparison to some other AI that has been infected. 2401 Penitent Tangent, who is more dumb than Cortana. Mendicant Bias, who is probably the smartest AI in all of Halo history. And those are just a few examples of intelligence infected by the flood using the logic plague. Now, once a grave mind gets to this point of being a large grave mind, they're going to want to infect ships to spread the infection further. Now, this can be called a proto-key mind, although there isn't an actual definition for it. But it's essentially when a grave mind attaches itself onto a ship itself, and it's large mass. So it's no longer just almost like a weird snake, but it is the ship itself. Now, they will also infect planets using the biomass on the planet and other species they've encountered to create a full-on key mind, which is also suggested to be a flood homeworld, although they don't actually have homeworlds. Now, a key mind is a fully infected planet, not just like a moon or anything, but a fully infected planet, where the grave minds that are on that planet are alive, and the planet itself is fully flood, and basically the planet is the grave mind. Now, here's a little known fact about the flood. We humans are third-dimensional beings. Now, the fourth dimension is something we cannot comprehend, but it is presumed to be time. Now, the flood are a fifth-dimensional being, meaning they have control of the fabric of space-time, which is a trait of the Precursors. Now, because of this, the flood are essentially gods, essentially because they are fully not all-powerful. Now, because of all this, when discussing a solution to the infection, the most powerful, intelligent, advanced, and strongest species in the galaxy had only one solution that could work, and that was to starve them to death. Now, the forerunner-flood war. After nearly 10,000 years of absence, the flood reappeared on the planet G617G1, a lightly inhabited world harboring some small commune of forerunners, and the flood initially caught the Forerunner military by surprise, using captured non-military vessels to penetrate local Forerunner naval blockades to descend and land upon Forerunner colonized worlds, overrunning local defenses and converting billions of Forerunners per world with hundreds of millions of flood forms. Eventually, Forerunner fleets were forced to commence orbital bombardment on flood-infested worlds to prevent the flood spread to other planets. Now, as the flood grew in number and became more intelligent in the process, the Forerunners identified a centralized intelligence coordinating efforts, the grave mind, the consciousness of the flood itself, embodied in an agglomerated collectives of biomass and millions of flood forms using attrition tactics. The flood gradually weakened the most formidable Forerunner naval countermeasures, one of which consisted using key ships and drawing the flood into pricey naval engagements. However, even the Forerunner commanders realized that their naval tactics were being overcome, and the new solution was necessary if the Forerunners were going to pull out of this stalemate. The highest levels and tiers of the Forerunner fleet command began to realize the Forerunner species' extinction was plausible at the flood's discretion, as so many Forerunners had fallen victim to the flood. As the flood continued to spread, planetary self-bombardment after flood infestation turned to complete system-wide destruction. By detonating planetary system stars after a large flood presence was detected in a Forerunner system, Forerunner military forces were ordered to don heavy armor, and other personnel were ordered into protective stasis. Flood were taken into M-type installations and studied in an effort to find yet another countermeasure. Hundreds of other unsuccessful methods were attempted by the forerunners to overcome the flood. Among these failed plans was the use of the composer, as I had mentioned before, which was a machine designed to circumvent flood infection by translating an organic's mental pattern into data, then transferring that pattern over to an artificial body devoid of flood infection. However, the process proved to be flawed because all infected forerunners treated with the composer succumbed to decay and a gruesome death. While galaxy-wide sterilization using the halo rings existed as an option, the forerunners would not resort to the halos until the very end, viewing them as they're contrary to their mantle to protect life, which is understandable. On a larger scale, the forerunners were relatively successful in keeping the flood threat contained during the initial stalemate. Lasting nearly 300 years, no more than 12 outer systems were lost over this period. For a significant amount of time, the forerunner government managed to suppress information on the flood threat, keeping its true nature hidden from the general populace of their core systems to avoid panic. The flood was publicly claimed to be a mutation-inducing disease caused by stellar radiation. However, during the stalemate, the flood was secretly readying for an attack. Now, the forerunners had created a powerful contender class AI known as Mendicant Bias, and tasked it with leading their defensive efforts. Mendicant had deployed major fragments of itself on numerous warships as well as all the 12 installations of the original Halo array, around 97,495 BCE. Mendicant Bias was charged with the first testing of the Halo, Gaia 11, near a former Precursor world, Charum Hakor. As a result of this small-scale activation, an ancient city imprisoned on Charum Hakor known as the Primordial was released and subsequently transported to Gaia 11 for study. Now, Gaia is essentially the state, like the word for Halo, so the 11th Halo of the original array. Now, Master Builder Faber was tasked Mendicant Bias with interrogating the Primordial before having Gaia 11 move to a hidden location to conduct his own unsanctioned experiments in secret. However, during its 43-long discourse with the Primordial, Mendicant Bias was convinced by the entity, actually a grave mind, to turn against its forerunner masters. Around the same time, Faber used a halo ring to suppress Senchayum instruction, practically wiping out the species aside from some samples indexed by the librarian. And the Ecumene Council deemed this as a severe violation against the mantle, and the remaining halo rings were brought to the capital and slated to be decommissioned, as they were deemed too destructive. This turned out to be a miscalculation on the forerunners' part, as the rampant Mendicant Bias would arrive aboard Installation 07, also known as Gaia 11, and take control of many of the Halo rings over the capital. Despite heavy resistance from foreigner fleets, Mendicant Bias successfully fired Gaia 11 in the capital system, delivering a catastrophic blow to the foreigner leadership for a time. While the foreigner government had downplayed the flood threat up to this point, they were now forced to take more drastic measures in order to survive. The Ecumene Council remained in disarray after Mendicant Bias was attacked, and the Didact had only remained returned from a millennium of exile. But the Master Builder, before being removed from power, had managed to capture the Didact and abandon him in a flood-infested region of the galaxy. However, the Didact had duplicated the essences of his another body, creating a secondary incarnation of himself known as the Didact. This copy assumed the role of the original Didact and reassumed command of the foreigner military. Hoping to defeat the Flood via conventional strategy, the Didact had reactivated his Shield's worlds and defense plan that he engineered thousands of years earlier. The Forerunners scored a temporary victory as the Didact's forces reclaimed Gaia 11 and captured the rampant Mendicant Bias, and the Ecumene Council, which had been crippled by Mendicant Bias's attack, was reinstated shortly afterward as the new council. Now, here's an excerpt of Mendicant Bias's hate-fueled diatribe against the Forerunners after the AI's defections to the Flood, and it is kind of unnerving. I kill you all and I enjoy it. I destroy you in your indolent billions. In your gluttony, in your self-righteousness, in your arrogance, I pound your cities into dust. I turn back the clock on your civilization's progress. What has taken you millennia to achieve, I erase in seconds. Welcome back to the Stone Age, vermin. Welcome home. Now, that is most likely an excerpt, kind of more of the Precursors saying that through Mendicant Bias, but it is definitely unnerving. And in the final years of the Forerunners, victory was short-lived. Mendicant Bias's defection and subsequent decapitating strike on the Old Council had marked a turning point in the course of the war. What had been most a steadily growing but relatively contained infestation now rapidly exploded beyond the hope of control. Using vessels and forces operated by both corrupted biologicals and AIs, supposedly marshaled during the decades of Mendicant bias and Installation 07 were missing, and the flood began to strike critical forerunner systems in overwhelming numbers. Due to the forerunners' previous cover-up of the flood threat, subverted forces were initially welcomed in many systems left unaware of their true nature. 2,000 systems were rapidly infected, coming home to flood hives. Undeterred, the flood continued to spread. With the forerunner defenses unable to stop the flood's advance, over 500,000 star systems were infected by the flood. The flood soon controlled 2/3 of the ecumene. These areas were referred to as burns, uninhabitable areas that they literally can't get into. When the flood threat began to spiral out of control, the forerunners resorted to ancient defensive barriers, or the ancient defensive barrier, Jat Krula, also often translated as the Maginot Line, which protected their core systems within the Orion complex. The forerunner leadership decided to focus on preservation of the systems within the line while leaving the rest of the ecumene to fend for themselves. The forerunners mostly succeeded in holding the flood at bay at this barrier before the end of the war, although the flood managed to breach the line in several locations. The forerunner librarian and her life workers journeyed beyond this line at a great personal risk, continuing their mission of indexing and documenting sentient species across the galaxy, filling every vessel possible with documented species for transit to the Ark for safety in the campaign to save all species possible from the advancing flood. Over a period of 4 years, the Isodidact commanded forerunner defense operations from within the line, leading forces combined from warrior servants and builder security. Although Mendicant bias had been disassembled and scattered across the ecumene, the facilities in which the disparate parts of the Matriarch were eventually overrun by the flood, and Mendicant was soon reconstituted as the commander of the flood fleets. Furthermore, as the flood gained more biomass, it continued to develop in more potent and dangerous forms. Massive compound mine nodes known as key mines were formed as entire planets were assimilated. The raw computing power of these enormous collectives could outwit even the most advanced forerunner AIs. The flood became more virulent as the infection took on more aspects, and the most prominent of these was the logic plague, the inability to subvert and corrupt foreigner artificial intelligences. This metaphysical form of corruption would eventually be perpetrated by any flood form or infected AI and rapidly spread across the foreigners' data networks. The foreigners' traditionals were forced to halt all legal proceedings as their principal network and many of their primary agents' catalog were overtaken by the logic plague. Even in the final years of the war, the foreigners were determined to salvage infested vessels and purge them of both biological and software infection wherever possible. Only a minute fraction of these attempts were ultimately successful, and eventually resulting in the foreigners terminating these efforts completely and opting for complete destruction of all infected ships. In the late stage of the war, the flood became powerful enough to use neural physics. Now, neural physics-based technology allowed them to take control of numerous precursor artifacts such as star roads that lay dormant across the galaxy for millennia. The foreigners did not possess any formidable defense against the sheer power and destructive capability of these precursor artifacts and constructs, which were capable of effortlessly dealing widespread devastation of entire foreigner fleets in seconds. After disabling their weapons and shields, the Star Roads corralled foreigner vessels into smaller units to allow their crews to be parasitalized by the flood. Less than 1/2 of the less than 1% of foreigner vessels attacked this way were able to self-destruct before they were overwhelmed. The precursor constructs were also capable of manipulating space-time to become unsuitable for foreigner slipspace travel and leaving entire fleets stranded or lost in anomalous slipspace transit. During this time, entire planets such as Trinal committed planet-wide mass suicide to deprive the flood of access to their biomass as potential hosts. The flood would then leave the dead world untouched, as there was nothing of interest on the planet, despite entire foreigner cities being left intact. Now, the endgame. Having evacuated the remaining foreigner population to safety, foreigner fleets were repositioned to defend a region of 4 themas. Nearly overrun by the flood, despite attaining a rare victory at the 7-8 thema, the foreigners continued to lose ground in most engagements. All surviving vessels from the last foreigner fleets were eventually reassigned under the command of Matriarch-class AI, Offensive Bias. Offensive bias was designed to replace and counter the rampant mendicant bias in a decisive last stand beyond Jad Sapar. The last combined Forerunner fleet faced massive swarms of infested ships, supported by thousands of star roads. With the defenses of the capital and their entire Orion complex failing, the Forerunner fleets across the galaxy began steadily ravaged by the Flood. Strategic command of the Ecumene was placed at the Greater Arc, which eventually held the last remnants of the Ecumene aside from minor pockets of survivors across the galaxy. The Librarian's biological specimens, including her core human population, once held on the Arc's surface, were moved to the nearby Omega Halo, which, along with Installation 07, was the last of the Master Builder's original halos. A handful of Forerunner military commanders survived to retreat to the Greater Arc, managing to bring a small number of warships with them to defend what was now the Ecumene's last bastion. The remaining Forerunner leadership gathered at the Greater Arc, including the Didact, who had been recovered from deep within the bird by the Master Builder soon after their arrival, and the Arc came under siege by mendicant bias and its fleet of Flood-controlled ships and star roads, and out of desperation, the remnants of the Council restored the Master Builder to command, as he was the only one with a realistic vision on how to stop the Flood, the Halo Array, which targeted all neural structures, including the Flood and the Precursor structures, thus capable of stopping them once and for all. While this was true, it was too late. Really late. And as he knew better than anyone else, he revealed the location of the Lesser Arc to the Didact and ordered him to go there. Now, the penultimate battle of the Forerunners was bitterly short. Omega Halo's primary weapon, having never actually been upgraded, could only fire in one direction, as it was only able to fire once, tearing a hole in the approaching flood wave and striking the large melogenic cloud. While seemingly devastating, the Flood paused only momentarily to restore their line, further delayed by only slightly by the desperate defense offered by offensive bias. Mendicant bias and the fleet destroyed Omega Halo and the Greater Arc, along with most of the Forerunner fleet. In the chaos just before the battle was joined, the Didact, who had been driven mad by the Grave Mind, used a composer to harvest the essences of all human population of Omega Halo, much to the horror of the Librarian, who had just placed all of her hope in humanity. The Didact planned to use the essences of both humans and his own Prometheans to build an army of mechanical warriors, which he believed could fight an extended campaign against the Flood. This was a grave transgression in the eyes of the Librarian, who had already laid plans for humanity as the successors to the Forerunners. In order to stop the Didact, the Librarian forcibly incapacitated him and imprisoned him within the shield world of Requiem in that ball. Now comes the firing of the Halos. The Didact, rescued from the destruction of the Mega Halo by Monitor Chakas, also known as 343 Guilty Spark, offensive bias, and the remaining Forerunners headed to the Lesser Arc, along with the surviving biological specimens from the Greater Arc. This formerly secret installation contained the Forerunners' final weapon, the newer Halo Array, which would purge this galaxy of all sentient life, depriving the Flood of all biomass that they would consume, thus halting them, and the 7 rings were deployed to their designated locations across the galaxy. And while firing preparations were conducted, Mendicant Bias and the Flood prepared to assault the Ark. In order to give the Didact time to fire the rings, the Librarian journeyed to Earth, broadcasting a faint message to draw the Flood there, ignoring the Didact's pleas to return to the Ark. The Didact calmly embraced her inevitable demise in the savannah near Mount Kilimanjaro, overlooking the construction of the portal to the Ark. To ensure enough time for the Halo Array to fire, the Didact ordered offensive bias and all that remained of Forerunner fleets to delay Mendicant Bias's fleet. While the Didact initiated the Halo Array's activation sequence, the Flood fleet engaged the last Forerunner fleet in a massive naval battle. Feigning incompetence and using delayed tactics, the offensive bias and his fleet held off the Flood as the Halo was activated, exterminating all sentient life in the Milky Way galaxy, with the previously Flood-controlled ships now adrift. Now, offensive bias annihilated Mendicant's remaining fleet within minutes. Offensive then proceeded to extract the last remaining shard of Mendicant bias from one of his core ships and return it to the Lesser Arc. Now, the Halo effect purged the galaxy of all sentient life, eliminating the threat of the Flood as it was deprived of available biomass and collective consciousnesses. All precursor artifacts and structures composed of abstract neural physics construction were likewise destroyed. These included the domain and metaphysical repository of knowledge treasured by the Forerunners as the source of all their cultural heritage and ancestral wisdom. The surviving Forerunners of the Ark, under the leadership of the Didact, imprisoned what was left to be thought of the last component of Mendicant Bias deep within Installation 00. The life forms sheltered on the Ark were eventually returned to their homeworlds and reintroduced to their native ecosystems, now free of the flood. By the remaining forerunners and their automatons, this process was led by the new life shaper chanted to Green. Despite the Lightworkers' best efforts, the firing of the Halos resulted in mass extinction events on countless worlds across the galaxy. Most prominently, those forerunners had never had time or resources to index. On many planets, the Lightworkers had prioritized which species to save. For example, it's only estimated that 1/1000th of Earth's largest species could survive. Around 4 years before the firing of Halos, 123 technologically capable species had been indexed. However, a number of these were doomed to perish due to the Lightworkers' limited resources. Combined with the devastation of the preserves of the Greater Ark and Omega Halo, many species also died out as well as a result of planetary ecosystems failing to properly recover after the reseeding during the subsequent period known as the Dark Time. After this reseeding effort was finished, the surviving forerunners left the galaxy, vowing to exclude themselves from the affairs of other species out of guilt over their failure as galactic custodians. The forerunners left the mantle to humanity so they could reclaim it instead, as the Precursors had intended millions of years earlier. Now that is everything we know pre-firing of the Halo array. I hope you guys enjoyed, I hope you guys learned something, and I hope there's something in here for everybody. I think that this is some of the coolest lore in the Halo universe, just the old Halo where it's essentially history, and I think it's really, really cool and very interesting, and I always have. And the Forerunner-Flood War is probably the biggest, most prominent war in all of Halo history, and it is a shame that there isn't any media other than just the books and terminals on it. So, hope you guys enjoyed. Hope you guys please leave a like and subscribe if you're watching on YouTube. If you're watching on TikTok, please give me a follow. Please like the video anyways, and I hope to see you guys in the next one. Please like and subscribe, give me a follow, and I'll see you all in the next one. Peace.